teaching seminar series. This is a 3-part series, and Jennifer has been kind enough to give me an opportunity to speak, and I'm grateful for your time, and I don't want to waste any of it. So let's get started. This thing's on rethinking how we learn. When I was 17 years old, I was taught this very painful lesson in this shallow notion of rote learning. I was elected college captain in year 11, and it meant that I was responsible for speaking at various events. And one of the most important events for the incumbent school captains was the information session for prospective Year 7 students. And it was crucial to make a good impression on the students and the parents so we could have a big intake the following year. But I was a rookie and I lacked experience. So I asked my friend Jason from the debating club to help me write my speech. With some persuasion, a little bit of charm, he ended up writing the entire speech for me, and I thought, easy, job done. Simply have to stand up there, read 1.5 pages into a microphone. Bring it on, I thought. And on the big day, I spent the entire afternoon reading the speech ad nauseum, essentially doing my best to rote learn. And I was so sick of rereading it over and over again that by the end of the school day, I stopped preparing early, thinking, I'm ready. Dust that off. But it was a huge mistake, as I would later learn. Now, by not generating my speech in my own words and by not integrating it into a personal and meaningful knowledge structure, I missed out on the deep learning that could weather the storms ahead, the robust learning that could withstand the anxiety and stress that I would be put under. So my preparation was superficial and my house of knowledge was built on sand. Now, that evening, I remember standing on stage, speech in hand, ready to address nearly 100 people in our college auditorium. And I started strong, confident, but halfway through, hit a snag. There was a sentence that felt completely alien to me. I read it awkwardly and I stumbled over it, rereading it 3 times in a row. And by that time, there were audible gasps in the audience. And I can recall looking up from my notes and all I could do, sort of look up and mumble the words, I'm sorry. And I put my head back in my hands. And the school principal got up off her chair. She rushed up to the lectern, grabbed my notes. She literally scrunched them up, put them in her pocket, told me to sit down and not get back up to speak as she took over. And everything thereafter became a big blur as my world just swallowed me up. So what's the moral of the story? Well, the hope that is by the time this presentation's over, we're going to improve our understanding of why things went so wrong for my 17-year-old self so that we can spare our students from the same fate. And specifically, my hope is that you'll join me in building a rich body of knowledge about what it takes to engage in deep and meaningful learning. And that's learning that's robust enough to weather the storms of life and overcome the confusion, the pressure, and the panic of the 17-year-old novice speaker that I used to be. And I'm still working on it. How are we going to tackle this? 4 parts to this journey. We're going to start looking at the predictive brain. Some of you may be familiar with that term, but I've found a lot of people have no idea about what's been happening in cognitive neuroscience in the last 20 years. And if that's you, this is going to be very valuable for you to get your head around that. Second part is how do we learn? I'm going to rely upon 3 theories of deep and meaningful learning because we're all academics and I understand that theories is like your love language. So we'll get into that, some of the literature in that as well. Then I'll look at 5 reasons to rethink how we learn and challenge you on that with a few provocations. Then we're going to finish with some practical tips about how we can learn better, which is probably the most important piece of the puzzle here. All right, so journey into the predictive brain. Let's test the technology here.
Okay, so tell me what you're seeing inside the image on screen. Squint your eyes if you have to. Now have another look at this image. What are you seeing on screen? And third one, have a look, see if there's any hidden images in there. And what about this? Is it making you hungry? Perhaps you want a strawberry after seeing this.
What are we looking at now? All right, so they're all the images. And I want you to look and see, now that you've got the reference point of this image of Jesus, second from the right, how do all the other images look when you squint your eyes at the screen? Hopefully you can see Jesus everywhere you're looking. Okay, another thing, more complex now. I hope you know your fairy tales well. I want you to read on screen the first half, part one of 2 parts in the Cinderella story. So I'll give you 15 seconds to read this. Okay, we ready for part 2? But before we get to part 2, I want you to draw upon your prior knowledge. Could be your prior knowledge of me, knowing that I like surprises. Could be your prior knowledge of this fairy tale. What happens next? Predict the future. Okay, you ready for the big reveal? I want you to spend the next 15 seconds reading this. Or Cinderella. Now, if you were jolted mentally when you read that, I'm going to explain why soon. It's not just me playing a sadistic joke on you. This was for scientific purposes, though I do like a little bit of a twist and turn in a plot. So let's talk about these 3 theories of deep and meaningful learning, and then we're going to revisit that, and hopefully that'll make sense in retrospect with the power of these theoretical lenses. The first is the Bayesian brain. This is what I meant about the predictive brain, right? And I'll explain who Thomas Bayes was and where that theory came, as well as Carl Friston, who's the modern father of that theoretical position. And I'll talk about levels of processing theory. Those of you who are in psychology will be very familiar with that. And you'll also be familiar with Ausubel's meaningful learning theory, who piggybacked a lot of Piaget's work in the assimilation and meaningful learning work that he did. So those are 3 theoretical lenses, but we'll stick with the Bayesian brain to begin, because this, I think, is the most poorly understood theory by educators and even psychologists. When I did some of my psychology training and my education training, I heard none of this. It was only my past boss at the University of Melbourne who got me onto this, because this was his whole world. And it's about this idea of the mental models we hold that are enriched by our past experience, as well as the things that we're evolutionarily endowed with. So that our past coming into collision with the present in order to better prepare for the future. That's essentially what Bayesianism is, the Bayesian brain. Now, Reverend Thomas Bayes in 1763 established a mathematical formula, a very basic formula that allowed him to look at what we call conditional probability, so that we can make inferences about the future. And this evolved into the Bayesian brain theory in 1995, where it was formally constructed by Neil and Richards. And then it manifested in 1999 in the free energy principle. So for those of you who are familiar with physics, will know that there's this idea of entropy, and free energy is at odds with that. And an active inference. And I won't go too far into those details, because I know it will bore some of you, but some of this is important to understand. So you're going to look at this and potentially cringe a little bit. But those of you who love a bit of mathematics, I've kept it hopefully at a level that others can look at this and start to understand if I break it down a little bit. So the difference with other theories is they're often a conceptual explanation compared to the Bayesian theory, where there was a formal mathematical explanation for how the brain thinks and learns. And that's why it's caught on so much. And why I think this is so important to understand is because it's the whole, under the hood of AI, sits all of this. This is how large language models work. This is how your phone works. This is how all the language processing mechanisms work in the entirety of that coding suite. So it sits as the fundamental bedrock, the mathematical language there in predictive and probabilistic modeling. And essentially it's this, is the posterior belief that we have from our experience, and we come into life with our prior experience. And there is the likelihood which we bring all of the data in. Right now, you're listening to me, you're starting to predict where's Luke going with this, and that's mixing with your prior experience of attending seminars like this, and you're starting to think, oh, okay, this is conventional. What's he going to do next? He's probably going to go to the next little piece of the puzzle. Great, so you predicted what's happening in real time, and that is then going to become the prior for your future predictions. So this is how the past, the present, and the future collide, and they move in this cycle, and we've got a mathematical model that does that. So essentially that's it. The prior that we have predicts, we'll talk about the Cinderella story here. So we predicted what was happening in the second half of the story based on our prior knowledge of the Cinderella fairy tale. And so we all had a mental model of it, even those of us who are vaguely familiar with it. Then we looked at the evidence that I showed with the first half of the story, and perhaps you made a prediction about the second half of the story based on that. So conditional, given the data, how true is it that the rest of the story will play out like the first half? So you're making a prediction, even if it's implicit. And then I purposely added an error into that. I challenged that. I tried to create this mismatch between your expectations and the reality of the data that was coming in. And at that point, once you get the error signal in your brain, you have that jolting experience of, hey, this is not the same Cinderella story I'm used to. Maybe Disney got their hands on it, or Luke got his hands on it, probably worse. You're sitting there and you're having to update in real time. And mathematically speaking, when we track learning using a Bayesian framework, that updating process to have a calibration between reality and our expectations, our mental model of reality, that is what learning is. That's a formalized mathematical model of learning. And there's a point at which you have diminishing returns when you continue to have a mismatch between what you're predicting and expecting of the world and what the data says is happening in the world. Once that starts to calibrate beautifully, that's called optimization. Right? We have an optimized model, and there's diminishing returns on any value of learning in that area. So we have more brain power to divert elsewhere. So you know about the Bayesian brain theory, but I'm going to break it down a little bit more, make it more simple so that the people who don't like the mathematics will understand the fundamental concepts here. So if you went in there saying to yourself, oh, the fairy's good, the fairy godmother's a good person, she's going to save the day. But we've got a contemporary lens here, right? So if someone's going to sit up in your face on the tram in Melbourne and offer you some pixie dust, they look like a stranger who's just happenstancing in your way, I don't know if you want to trust them. So perhaps if you had that cynical mindset, you wouldn't have had a large prediction error. But for those of you who are drawing upon your prior knowledge of fairy tales where fairy godmothers are good, there was a large prediction error. And so you learn proportional to the error, right? So the mismatch between expectations and reality, that gap is where learning happens, and we can mathematically represent that. And that's why probabilistic models are so powerful with computational learning and AI and where the future's going with that. Because this can add layers and layers and layers and layers, endless layers onto Bayesian models around probability and the weights of past experience and reinforcement learning and how they shape how we expect our future data to look. So here's the people who thought the worst of the fairy godmother. Your prediction was correct. There was no prediction error. And your brain went into conservation mode. That's really important because learning serves this incredible purpose. You know, the job's brain, if it had the brain's job, mine's not working, obviously. The brain's job description, if it had one, would be to keep us alive. And its primary person, the CEO of achieving that, the brain appoints the role of chief learning officer to do that. So learning is about keeping the body alive. That's the best way the brain can prepare for the future. right? And so spending energy, this organ that weighs about 2% of our body's weight, spends over 20% of the body's energy. Now, how does it justify that incredible expense? Well, it invests in learning all the time, preparing for the future, right? To keep the body and the brain alive. So the brain gives it that energy because it justifies it very well. And so when we have areas in which we have already learned to a level of automatic knowledge, deep knowledge, robust knowledge, we've got the bandwidth to redirect elsewhere and learn new things. And that's the kind of predictive modeling there. I think Lisa Barrett-Feldman, who's the president of the APA, she wrote a beautiful book about this. I've got it on my bookshelf somewhere behind me. And she said it well. So think about it like this, a conversation with ourselves, our past, present, and future selves, right? So predictions are just your brain having a conversation with itself. A bunch of neurons make their best guess about what will happen in the immediate future based on whatever combination of past and present that your brain is currently conjuring. Those neurons then announce that guess to neurons in the other brain areas, changing their firing. Meanwhile, sense data from the world and your body injects itself into the conversation, confirming or not the prediction that you'll experience in reality. And you can see this all the time in learning in classrooms and learning in our institute here. Just at a very basic level, when you're giving yourself a quiz or your students a quiz, they've got a mental model, right? They're generating and tapping into their prior knowledge as they read the question stem. Then they look at the 4 options, A to D, and they're generating a prediction in their mind about which is the most probable outcome to answer or solution for that question. And then all of a sudden, if they get confirmation that they knew that when they get the answers, fine. There's not much learning that goes on there. They might have some level of reinforcement to say, hey, you already knew this, good job, move on. But if it's jolting and they get the answer incorrect, that error creates an opportunity and it primes your brain for learning. And at that point, that's where the feedback is most powerful. Because at that point, it's like a slingshot in your mind. We feel the resistance of the error and we want to find out why. Our brain wants to be able to have a better adaptive capacity for the future. So its mental model wants to be enriched so it doesn't make the same mistake again. There's a couple of other examples on screen, but that's the kind of fundamental principles there. If it all sounds too technical, it's basically when our expectations, so the Bayesian brain, if you want to explain it to someone else and they ask you, because everyone asks this question, what does the Bayesian brain mean? It's when our expectations match reality and we conserve energy and learning is minimized, right? So we start to go into a maintenance mode. But when our expectations or our mental models of reality, when they're mismatched, when there's an error, we spend the energy revising and learning's maximized. And the power of this is not just the conceptual aspect of this, it's the mathematical modeling behind it and where it's gone. And it's really one of the dominant theories of learning in the world today, in the science of learning. However, let's go back to the other couple of theories there. We talked about Ausubel's meaningful learning theory. Some have called it, and Ausubel uses the term assimilation theory, because he's riding the coattails of Piaget. Remember, his era is right off the back of Piaget's peak. And Piaget was the godfather of assimilation and accommodation schema theory. And the schema is just another word for a mental model. And so that's the generative models that they talk about in the Bayesian brain theories. Piaget's words would have been the schema. All right. And Ausubel sort of rode that wave of development, that era of development. And he talked about his meaningful learning theory and the assimilation theory. And this is what he said about it. Knowledge is meaningful by definition. It is the meaningful product of a cognitive, knowing psychological process involving the interaction between logically and culturally meaningful ideas, relevant background knowledge, what he called anchoring, and in particular, the learner's cognitive structure or the structure of that person's knowledge and their mental set to learn meaningfully or to acquire and retain knowledge. He was where the popular notion of rote learning came from. So when he talked about meaningful learning, and we contrast that at the other end with shallow or meaningless learning, often referred to as rote learning, as I mentioned in my opening story, that all came from this guy. So Ausubel was an intellectual giant of his time, and I think we got to pay homage to him. So he talks about this idea of the continuum of knowledge. And at one end is this rote learning, shallow and meaningless, isolated, unstable, prone to interference, contextual interference, cognitive interference. So very unstable views. Then you've got your anchored, stable, robust learning. That's the deep and meaningful learning that we want to promote in our students. You've got this the surface level understanding, right? Glossing over everything, a mile wide and an inch deep. This is the ChatGPT era that we've got to be careful of. We just touch the surface of everything because we're outsourcing our deep processing and our thinking to a computer instead of using our brains for that very task. He talks about lack of application versus real world application. Can you bring that knowledge from a state of potential into the real world where you apply it and turn it from knowledge to skills? And that's a very powerful piece because you don't know what you don't know until you try and apply it, and all of a sudden you eat humble pie. Minimal engagement, active engagement. So this is the Ausubel meaning, deep and meaningful learning contrasted with shallow and meaningless learning, otherwise known as rote learning. This is what we want to try and promote in our students. And I think it's even more powerful now, like I said, in an era in which information's cheap, right? And everyone's going a mile wide and an inch deep with information. And I think a timely quote here from Charles Munger, if any of you know him. He was the sidekick to Warren Buffett before I think he passed on recently. He's one of the richest men in the world, and he started some of the biggest investment firms in the world, and they all joined together, and there's a real empire. But he said this: the first rule is that you can't really know anything if you just remember isolated facts and try bang them back. If the facts don't hang together on a lattice work of theory, you don't have them in a usable form. You've got to have models in your head, and you've got to arrange your experience, both vicarious and direct, on this lattice work of models. You may have noticed students who just try to remember and pound back what is remembered. Well, they fail in school and they fail in life. You've got to hang experience on a lattice work of models in your head. And I think he knew what he was talking about in terms of the real world application. Now, I've got another thought experiment with you. I know some people will know this one very well, so I'd ask you not to put in any spoilers in the chat. But if you read this, spend the next sort of 20 seconds reading this paragraph, trying to make sense of it. What's going on here? Okay. Now, I'd usually ask people to speak up over the microphone and say, have a guess at what's going on. But I feel like if I go back and check the chat, you might lose my microphone again. We'll have that problem. So I'm just going to continue to steamroll on and assume you've put some ideas into the chat thread. Okay. If you've seen this experiment before, this is a classic. It was done by Bransford and Johnson in 1972. Off the back again of the Piaget's work on schema theory and assimilation and accommodation, and then again Ausubel's work, and people are starting to realize how important prior knowledge is at this point, the mental models we have. And so this theory was put to the test in this experiment where they asked people in the experimental conditions to read that paragraph just as you did now, naive to the fact that it was a person doing the washing. Right? They were naive to that. Without that single piece of prior knowledge, the way they saw the world was completely confused. They failed to remember it and failed to comprehend it. Then in the control group or the informed group, they told them the passage was about doing the washing before reading. They remembered twice as much and they understood. So their comprehension was high, their retention was very high. So if you look back over this, and you reread that in light of this idea that they're doing the washing, all of a sudden the pennies drop. It all makes sense now. And this is like the illuminating power of prior knowledge and how we don't interpret the world as it is, we interpret the world as we are. And there's a very powerful science behind that. All right, so let's move on. Final theory, levels of processing theory. I'll go through this one quickly because it's essentially adding nuance to what we've just talked about. It's about this idea. The concept of depth of processing is not hard to grasp. Deeper refers to the analysis of meaning, inference, and implication in contrast to shallow analyses such as surface form, color, loudness, and brightness. And this theory was put to the test experimentally in a famous series of studies in 1972, and I've got one from 1975 by Craik and Tolving. And what they're doing here is they're creating 3 levels of processing of information, and then they're testing people, which was, so they divide them into 3 groups. The first group gets appointed to just focusing on the uppercase letter characteristics, so the surface characteristics. What's their retention of a word list of 60 words going to be? Then the next group were appointed into the rhyming group, so that kind of intermediate analysis, what we call a sort of micro-mnemonic. So rhymes can help us remember things. So they're saying, what does this word rhyme like? What does it rhyme with? Sorry. Then the other ones who had the deeper learning conditions, right? They were told to think about the meaning, the function of the object, what it's connected to, what it relates to, what it's used for. That's the semantic analysis group. And here's some really stark results, the difference there and why this theory became so powerful. Because we have the superficial to the left where they're looking at the case of the letters, at the uppercase letter characteristics. They basically score at chance level, right? In terms of the recall and recognition of the words when they were put to a test, a follow-up test. The rhyming group was double that, so a lot better. So rhymes are a decent mnemonic device for us to remember, but they're not deep learning. They're sort of intermediate. And then there's the deep learning, the semantic analysis category, 86%, right? So they're absolutely crushing the superficial learning group. And I hope that's very convincing in terms of where we want to go with our students. If we want them to have lifelong learning, it's obvious where we need to point them. The deep and meaningful learning is the most powerful in terms of preparing them for that. Here's the formalization of their structure. I won't go into the detail because that's essentially what it was, just how I explained it then. So they're saying that the memory trace can be understood as a byproduct of perceptual analysis and that the trace persistence is a positive function of the depth to which the stimulus has been analysed in the first place. Essentially, if you encode it deeply in the first place, you remember it longer and better. Okay, take a breath, check the time. In light of all that, I've got 5 propositions for you. I'll roll through them, and I'm hoping this really does answer the question of why we should rethink how we learn, particularly in higher education, I think in an AI world. The first thing I want to challenge you on to rethink how you learn is based on all of that science. We know that learning happens more from the inside out than the outside in. People think learning is what's done to them. You know, getting information from the environment, and we somehow become like a sponge. I hear the analogy that students are like sponges. No, it's not what the science says. Our expectations are our predictive models. They guide our reality. And only when those mental models are violated, as in there's an error between their expectations and reality, do we update that? Because it's too metabolically costly to just take in information indiscriminately like a sponge. That is not how we learn. We're very discerning about it. And remember, the brain's a very expensive organ to run. It's got to be selective. So this whole notion of the classical model of information getting in as your primary mechanism of learning, that's not what we should do. It's not about pushing information into our students, right? It's misleading. And this is all through our textbooks, all through the textbooks behind me, all the educational psychology textbooks. It's everywhere. And I teach on this stuff, and this is still valuable, but it's very misleading because it's disproportionate to what's really going on. And you'll know this as the Atkinson-Shiffrin model. And they called this just a conceptual metaphor. They didn't actually think that this is exactly how learning happens. And I won't go too far into the details, but it's essentially this 3 categorical memory systems. 3 different categories of memory systems: sensory memory systems, the short-term store and the long-term store. And now we've got kind of working memory dovetailing in there with the short-term memory. But like I said, most of the learning's from the inside out, not the outside in. So that could be misleading. Stanislas Dehaene, who's the world-renowned neuroscientist, he's written some brilliant books, one of which is called How We Learn. He sums it up this way. Our brain is therefore not simply passively subjected to sensory inputs. Learning in man and machine always starts from a set of a priori hypotheses, in other words, our prior knowledge, which are projected onto the incoming data and from which the system selects those that are best suited to the current environment. And so this created some debate in the last sort of 20, 30 years when people are realizing learning happens from the inside out more than the outside in. It's actually further back than that. There was a bit of a schism in the literature and between the two camps. You got the Gibson sort of early days literature saying it happens from the outside in. You push information into students' heads, that's how they learn, that's how perception happens, and that's called the bottom-up approach. But we know that there is nothing that happens from a bottom-up perspective that wasn't preceded by a top-down modeling process. And so this is kind of where the future has gone. Most people in that sort of space of the cognitive neuroscience, and certainly in light of all the AI changes, how we're seeing this happen with a lot of these predictive modeling successful in AI, so we're starting to see a lot of people jump on board this top-down processing perspective where you've got perception occurring at higher levels. That's why we call it a top-down, sort of in our frontal lobe regions. And it becomes the prism of prior knowledge that shapes our expectations of the world. And we see the world as we are, not as it is. We impose that those subjective prism on the world and color it with the brush of our own subjectivity. Next reason, we learn by generating experiences. This is often independent of sensory input. Now, you'll see in a lot of these textbooks, when you look at the classical definition, even ChatGPT, I was sort of asking it, what's the definition of learning? It comes up with something like this. Learning is a relatively permanent change in behavioral knowledge that occurs as a result of experience. Right? But I'm trying to challenge this right now, and a lot of the science challenges this. Experience results from learning more than learning results from experience. So I'll leave that as a bit of a provocation. Anil Seth talks about this as a controlled hallucination. Top-down predictions do not merely bias our perception, they are what we perceive. Our perceptual world, alive with colors, shapes, and sounds, is nothing more, nothing less than our brain's best guess of the hidden causes of its colorless, shapeless, and soundless sensory inputs. And this has implications beyond learning. This is also work on consciousness that dovetails into this. And I know some of you have got that philosophical bent, so I'll indulge you. But the idea here is that our brain can experience the world only ever indirectly, in the sense that it's in a dark cave. It's never seen light. It's never smelt anything. It's never tasted anything. And yet we experience that subjectively. All right, so the skull shields your brain from the outside world. No direct sensory input. Experience is always internally generated in order to meet with information from the outside world. And that's the brush we paint reality with. The outside environment may play a small or negligible role, and that's because it's too costly for our brains to continue to take information in indiscriminately. And so when we think, we're doing it with this propensity to only think very deeply and pay the price of learning when there's violations to our expectations. I think I'll skip through some of this. The main thing is here, just to kind of picture this movement from thesis to antithesis, and now a bit of a synthesis, right? I don't want to be too extreme here. So this old model, the thesis was learning happens because information is getting poured into the head, right? So this world of rich information, somehow a little bit of it makes it into our brains, and that's what learning is. Now we know that a lot of what goes on is about brain constantly pushing out information to test against real world data and see if there's violations of expectations. If there is, we attend to it, then we integrate it, assimilate it, and learn. It's a bit of both. This is the synthesis now, right? So we went from thesis to antithesis to the synthesis. And the analogy I use here is this information highway, right? So it's like seeing on one side of the road a huge amount of information heading in one direction. And that's the information going out of our brains. That is the default mode of our brains, constantly projecting upon the world, right? Even internally when we sleep, the information is still happening. No sensory input, just still going at it. And then a little bit of traffic on the incoming side. And we intake some of that, right? Because we can't indiscriminately take on all the information. It's just too costly for our brains to survive that way. Okay. Another reason, prior knowledge predicts future knowledge. And that's kind of like the Ausubel theory, right? So the way we talk about this in the literature is the Matthew effect, or the rich get richer effect, where more prior knowledge predicts more future knowledge. And so it's really important for us. I think the implication for us as teachers is to build the prior knowledge, enrich the prior knowledge. The foundational stages of knowledge are so important because they snowball, they cascade through the semester. And as that student has those foundations there, they're going to pick up more. You build their intellectual capital because you help them build it themselves. Ausubel said, the most important single factor influencing learning is what the learner already knows. Ascertain this and teach accordingly. And then, as I mentioned, there's a lot of work on the rich get richer effect, otherwise known as the Matthew effect. If prior knowledge facilitates new learning, then students with higher prior knowledge should more readily acquire new knowledge compared to students with lower prior knowledge. Yeah, we refer to that as the rich get richer effect, but it's actually very powerful. And it taps into this idea of knowledge compounding. So over a lifetime, it makes a huge difference. Just like you invest your superannuation in the right place, it's going to make a big difference to how you retire. It's the same with investing our knowledge. Fourth reason, learning involves updating prior knowledge and is fundamentally error-driven. Right? So mistakes aren't something to chastise our students against and castigate them for. It's something that we should normalize, we should celebrate. And we should know that one of the closest synonyms to learning is error and how we make mistakes. So I think a successful learning environment understands that success comes through repeated failure. It seems like a bit of an oxymoron there, but it's more of a paradox. Another reason, the final reason to rethink how we learn. Learning helps our brain fulfill its job of keeping us alive. And so my Ted Lasso days are over at the moment. I haven't been watching it lately, but you'll know this little meme. Football is life. I like to say learning is life. Like I said, the brain's job description is to keep us alive. The first thing it does to do that is to appoint the role of our brain, a chief learning officer in the brain, and learning is how it's done. Learning is life. Einstein knew that. All right. Oh, yes. Okay. Cost of living crisis. That's something we discuss a lot, but our body has one all the time. It's under constant cost of living crisis, and learning reduces that, right? Because it shows it has an accumulative value so that the price of intake of new information, that can be more discerning about that, not necessarily spending all of the metabolic energy at loss on everything it sees. Learning is how we frame that so that we can filter out a whole lot of information that isn't going to pay off for our survival and benefit our future in flourishing. All right, I think I'm almost running out of time, but maybe we'll have a bit of time to just go through three implications, three actions. I got 12:45 on my watch. Jennifer, how much time do I have? I got a few minutes. We're good? All right, how very ironic, right? I'm talking about learning is coming from the inside out, and I'm just bulldozing you with it from the outside in. So I'm feeling like a bit of a hypocrite at the moment, but we'll get there. Three more things. I'll skip through some of this. How do we learn better? Here's the three things I want you to take away. There's really practical things. You're going to say, oh, you're telling me to suck eggs, Luke. I knew all this, but there are levels to this game, right? I always think that the most profound elements of teaching and learning are things that we happenstance upon, that are natural to us, because these things are in our bones. We are evolved to learn and teach. It's part of our species nature. However, there is a science that can help us get better and refine that. And it's the deliberate and systematic integration and adopting those practices, constantly challenging yourself to get better and go from that lower level, the default mode of storytelling, for example, or asking questions or thinking with in a sort of intellectual ecology about you with links, right? There are levels to that. And so that's my challenge to you, is to take yourself to the next level. Find out where you're at, take yourself to the next level. One of the ways to do that, harness the power of story. And the reason why this is so powerful is we think in stories, not just facts. Our stories become the schema, the mental model that brings together a whole heap of otherwise disparate, isolated facts. The stories bring it together in a cohesive web of knowledge. And we're evolved to do that. So storytelling helps make sense of chaos, creating a coherent web of knowledge, enriched schemas, if you will. And the way that we can manipulate stories, there's a whole science behind this now. Some fantastic work being done with the Hodometer project. I recommend you check out their website. I think they've got over 100 classic books on there that they've done very complex analysis with. And they've looked at narrative arcs in the stories. So if you want to have a successful story by design, think about the narrative arc. The one I used earlier in my intro story, if you can have a guess, was a bit of an Icarus story, wasn't it? A rise to fall. But there are these narrative arcs that we can integrate in the stories we tell our students and the stories we live by. And if we can be intentional and systematic about that, I think you're going to take it to the next level. There's a good science to support that. Here's some of the reasons why they stick. They stick in our memory. I think the biggest factor is structured to guide expectations. Right? And the emotional and engaging element, the personal relevant aspect there, this is where the science says storytelling can actually help. One of my dear friends, Jared Cuny-Horvath, he and I worked together at the Science of Learning Research Centre at the University of Melbourne for a few years. He's now gone to the States again. I think he's back at Harvard. He wrote this book, talked about the power of storytelling, and he's given you some tips there, 7 tips on screen. I won't read them out because we're going to run out of time, but I'll distribute the slides and you can have a look. I also want to have a nod to, First Nations peoples, because they were onto this. They had a very rich science before we actually knew that they had a very rich science underpinning their culture and the intergenerational memories. And one of the ways we see that happening, we can celebrate this incredibly advanced civilization, is that all of the knowledge passed down through the generations through things like yarning circles. Right? So this is a beautiful thing to kind of honor our First Nations peoples by adopting yarning circles in our classrooms, telling stories, both personal stories, but stories about the world that we're trying to understand, the world that we're trying to improve. So let's take a leaf out of their book in the process. I put this prompt in ChatGPT and said, make me a image of First Nations peoples doing a yarning circle. And it literally put balls of yarn in front of them. So there's a limitation to AI. We're going to run out of time, so I might finish up soon, but asking deep and meaningful questions. I think Socratic questioning is a really good one. It's instead of telling students what to think, you empower them how to think and answer their own questions. Right? And asking the right questions is more important than giving them the right answers. I'll quickly move through this. I think the main slide is that one. There are levels to this game of asking effective questions. We all ask questions, but we know the most effective teachers do it in a different way, and they do it more often. They're asking open-ended questions, counterfactual questions, higher order thinking questions about analysis, hypotheticals, provocations that are meaningful and relevant to their student. What would happen to you if your grandma, instead of coming to Australia, went to another country? What would happen to you? What would happen to your culture if this other country took over that other country? What would happen if? Can create some really deep discussion and meaningful learning. The final one is generating, linking, and elaborating. It's this idea of the generation effect. And this is where I'll point to AI as a bit of a critic. AI is like outsourcing the generation effect. And that's why I have a suspicion that if not used properly, can undermine deep and meaningful learning. Because we know that when we generate information about target material using our own words and thought processes, that leads to deeper encoding compared to when we simply read or hear the same ideas from the outside source, such as a teacher, parent, peer, video, talk, etc. This has been around and known for quite a while. No, there's some good research here about asking students to remember the target words. So if I'm asking you to remember 100 words, and I get you to generate the opposite word in your own mind and generate it yourself, as opposed to saying hot and cold. I say hot and you generate the answer to that. You say cold. If you're in that condition, you're going to remember a whole lot more. And that's a very simple level, but it does extrapolate to more complex tasks. I think that is essentially the big picture there. Getting your students to generate their own questions is more important than giving them the answer. How they do it, there's levels to that game. I think concept maps are a beautiful way to do that if you do them well, and they don't just look like my whiteboard in my office where it's a tangled up mess. But if we're going to do it about the nervous system, just as an example, you might start with a toy example, right? Nervous system divided, bifurcated into central, peripheral nervous system, and then you got the bifurcations there. And then they can write their own and generate their own questions about what those do, how they function. And you start writing that off onto different nodes and different elaborative pieces of information. It can be very generative. That would be a more advanced representation of the nervous system. But notice that there's the ability to make order out of chaos. That's what concept maps allow us to do. They build a schema, a deliberate schema, for us to then make the world our library and organize and interpret information and place it and situate it with structure so that we know where to go. Instead of being in a library of information where it's random and ad hoc, we know exactly where all the books are held. That's what happens when we have a powerful mental model to organize information. I'll finish on this one because I think this is a timely one. Artificial intelligence or human stupidity? And I love what my esteemed colleague, Dr. Jonathan Sargent, said. He said, we want our students to get an education, not just a degree. And I think that underpins the existential challenge of an AI era of learning. And the questions I have for you are, does AI help or hinder by substituting or complementing critical and creative thinking and deep thinking? Does it help or hinder deep processing? Does it help or hinder effortful practice? Or is it like outsourcing your workout to someone else at the gym? Are you going to get any benefits when someone else does a workout on your behalf? Well, maybe that's analogous to what's happening when we let AI do all the heavy intellectual lifting, right? So we have to know how to use it responsibly and encourage our students to do so. I think I'll call it a day.